There are roads that lead nowhere, not because they end, but because they turn into a trap for all who set foot on them. In the winter of '39 in the north, amidst the snowbound forests near the Finnish border, such a road became a narrow forest track along which an entire Soviet division was moving. It entered there at full strength, with tanks, artillery, supply trains, and thousands of men. And a few weeks later, all that remained of it were abandoned equipment, frozen engines, and a long chain of footprints that led into the forest and never returned. The snow covered it all with an even white layer, and from the outside it seemed as if nothing had ever happened here. In reality, one of the most illustrative disasters of that war had occurred here. How did it happen that a large, well-armed formation, which had everything needed to win, ended up being cut to pieces and destroyed by an enemy that was noticeably smaller and far more modestly armed? This is the main question worth returning to those forests near Suomussalmi for. Because the answer lies not in ideology, not in slogans, and not in poster images. The answer lies in the conditions into which people were led by others' decisions, and in what happened when the familiar logic of force ceased to work. To understand the scale of what happened, one must recall how it all began. In the late autumn of '39, a war broke out between a vast neighbor and a small northern country. From the outside, it looked like a foregone conclusion. On one side of the scale was an army with a huge number of divisions, tanks, aircraft, and artillery. On the other, the troops of a state whose population was smaller than that of some of the enemy's major cities. Plans were built on the assumption that resistance would be brief and the advance swift. On the maps in headquarters, arrows confidently stretched deep into foreign territory. And among these arrows was one aimed through the northern forests towards an important road junction. This junction was the Suomussalmi area. In itself, it did not look like a significant place. A few villages, lakes, endless forest, and a couple of roads connecting this remote corner with the rest of the world. But it was precisely through it that a route passed which, if successful, would lead the advancing units into the depths of the country and threaten to split it in two. That is why troops were sent there, and that is why those who intended to defend this road gathered there as well. On paper, everything again looked logical. Seize the crossroads, hold it, exploit the success. On the ground, this meant leading heavy, overloaded columns along the only suitable road, flanked on both sides by dense winter forest. It is in this detail that the entire tragedy is hidden. The division entering this area was structured as was customary for war on open terrain. It relied on machinery, on tractors, on trucks with ammunition and fuel, on field kitchens and supply trains. All of this could only move along the road. To step off it just a few paces meant a man would sink into snow up to his waist, and vehicles would simply get stuck. As a result, a huge mass of people and machines ended up stretched into a long, narrow ribbon, extending for many kilometers. This ribbon had no flanks in the conventional sense. It only had a head, a tail, and defenseless sides pressed against the forest. The forest here must be imagined not as a sparse park, but as a dense, snow-clogged wall of spruces, windfall, and frozen swamps, where visibility sometimes ended just a few steps away from a person. In such a forest, the usual rules of war change. Artillery loses its field of view and fires almost blindly. Aircraft cannot see targets under the canopy, and observation is reduced to a narrow corridor along the road. What would have given a decisive advantage in open terrain here turned into dead weight that had to be dragged along the single track and guarded. The forest nullified precisely those advantages on which the attacking side had counted most. The enemy, however, approached this war quite differently. The defending units were few in number. They had almost no tanks and little artillery, but they were at home, in the forest they had known since childhood, and they knew how to live and fight in it. Their soldiers moved on skis, wore white blended with the snow, and appeared where they were not expected. They did not try to stop the column with a frontal blow because they understood they would lose in an open clash. Instead, they chose a different path, to let the long ribbon draw deeper into the forest and then cut the road in several places at once. Mobility was their main weapon, and it worked where the column was chained to the road. Small ski groups emerged from the depths of the forest, delivered a short strike, and disappeared just as quickly before a response could be organized. For the surrounded, this meant constant tension without respite. One could never tell exactly from which direction the next attack would come. A person who can neither rest, nor warm up, nor take cover, loses strength faster than under direct fire. Thus, the mobility of one side turned into the slow exhaustion of the other. This is how the tactic was born that would later be called by a short local word meaning a severed, trapped piece. Its meaning was simple and merciless. Small mobile units intercepted the road between parts of the stretched column, felled trees, mined passages, and set up ambushes. A single division instantly disintegrated into separate, isolated groups, locked on their own segment of the road. Each such group found itself in its own small ring, cut off from its neighbors, from the rear, from supplies, and from help. And here the true logic of this war began to work. It was not so much combat that was to destroy the enemy, but cold, hunger, and time. Here it is worth pausing to speak of what the people inside these surrounded segments felt, because without this, the whole story turns into a dry diagram. The frosts during those weeks dropped to levels hard to imagine for those who have not endured them, around -40, sometimes even lower. In such cold, metal becomes brittle, lubricants thicken, engines refuse to start. A person in an ordinary greatcoat, without proper winter clothing and warm shelter, in an open place becomes a target for the bitter cold faster than for bullets. A fire gave away one's position and could not be lit without risk. Hot food came rarely or not at all. And all this lasted not for hours but for long days and nights on end. The wounded deserve special mention because their fate best illustrates what war means without a thought-out evacuation. Under normal conditions, a wounded soldier is quickly taken to the rear, where there is warmth, doctors, and time for aid. Here, there was no rear at all. The road was cut, there was nowhere to take them, and the wounded remained right where misfortune had struck them, in the frost, under the open sky. Where elsewhere a person would have survived, here the cold finished what the wound had begun. This quiet, invisible arithmetic of the unevacuated claimed lives no less than the fighting itself, and almost never made it into any dramatic reports. The men in these rings were not cowards. Among them were many who held out to the very end, who repelled attacks, carried out the wounded, shared their last morsel, and did not abandon their positions even when common sense suggested there was no way out. Their misfortune lay not in a lack of courage, but in the fact that they were led into conditions where courage decided almost nothing. One can be as steadfast as possible, but if one's hands are frozen, ammunition is spent, there is no hot food, no communication, and no rear support, one's steadfastness works against the cold and hunger, not against the enemy. This is a very important thought for the entire history. The bravery of the rank-and-file soldier and the miscalculation of headquarters are different levels of the same catastrophe, and it would be both dishonest and incorrect to blame the defeat on those who froze in the forest. What happened with the delivery of supplies and logistics deserves separate discussion, because it was here that the catastrophe was predetermined even before the first serious battles. A division tied to a single road is supplied through that road with everything: fuel, shells, cartridges, bread, fodder. If the road is cut in several places, each isolated segment is left with precisely what it managed to accumulate. And in conditions of a rapid march along a narrow track, accumulating almost anything was nearly impossible. Trucks stood bumper to bumper, they were burned and shot up, fuel did not get through, and the equipment on which the main hopes were pinned turned into immobile iron boxes along the roadsides. On paper, this was a motorized force. On the ground, it was a string of stuck vehicles that could neither be turned around nor withdrawn. Reinforcements deserve separate mention as well, because here another trap was at work. When those at the top realized the column was in trouble, the natural desire arose to throw new units there. But these new units had to be introduced along the same narrow road and in piecemeal fashion, because there simply was no other route. Fresh soldiers entered the same corridor where their predecessors had already perished and fell into precisely the same ambushes. On paper, this was strengthening the grouping. On the ground, it meant that more and more people were being driven one after another into the same trap, and the numerical advantage was being expended in vain, with no possibility of falling upon the enemy with the full mass at once. The tanks, which were supposed to be the decisive argument, proved almost useless in these forests. They had nowhere to turn. The narrow road did not allow them to deploy into a battle formation, and moving off into the deep snow and forest meant getting stuck. Therefore, even where armored vehicles were present, they could most often only move one behind the other along the same fire-swept track. It was enough to knock out the lead and tail vehicles for the others to find themselves locked between them, as if in a stone sack. The enemy's mobile groups calmly bypassed this traffic jam through the forest and shot it up piece by piece. It turned out that the advantage in equipment, which looked overwhelming on the headquarters map, on this road became an additional burden. And here one cannot avoid the question of the decisions that gave rise to all this. The main mistake was made not in the forest, but much earlier and much higher up, where the decision was taken to drive an entire heavy formation along a single forest road, in the depths of the northern winter, without proper reconnaissance, without reliable flank protection, without established winter tactics, and without a thought-out evacuation plan. It was a decision made by people who looked at a map and saw arrows, not snow, not frost, not the forest, and not an enemy skilled at living in that forest. The headquarters' overconfidence here is not a figure of speech, but a very concrete thing. The confidence that numerical and technical superiority was enough to disregard the conditions. The war near Suomussalmi very quickly showed the price of that confidence. What happened with communication and command separately shattered the entire structure. While the column moved as a single whole, orders still somehow traveled from head to tail. But as soon as the road was cut in several places, the isolated segments ceased to hear each other and those who commanded them. Each group saw only its own short stretch of road and the wall of forest around it, and no one inside the ring had any picture of the overall situation anymore. Decisions that seemed reasonable at the top arrived with delay or not at all at the bottom, and attempts to coordinate an attack by different groups broke against the simple impossibility of reaching an agreement. An army deprived of unified command ceases to be an army and turns into a collection of separate pockets, each fighting alone. When the rings closed and the isolated groups began to perish one by one, events rolled toward the denouement with frightening speed. Attempts to break through, to link up, to escape to friendly lines, most often ended on that same road, under fire from the forest. Some tried to move away through the snow to the side, and these attempts were often cut short by the bitter cold before any encounter with the enemy. Command disintegrated, communication broke down, and the unified formation ceased to exist as a whole, turning into scattered pockets, each living out its own brief span. By the time it was all over, the long road was littered with abandoned and burned-out equipment, and the human losses proved very heavy. The side that controlled this road after the battles gained not only victory, but also a huge quantity of abandoned materiel: weapons, ammunition, vehicles, equipment. For a less wealthy side, this was serious support, and it was from here that part of the striking stories later grew about how a small army armed itself at the expense of a large one. But behind this trophy glitter, one must see the main thing. All of this once belonged to living people who were led into this forest and left without a real chance. It is important to pause here and speak honestly about the numbers, or rather, about caution with them. The losses near Suomussalmi and on the adjacent road were great. Practically everyone acknowledges this, but the specific figures differ noticeably across sources. Historians argue about exactly how many people were killed, froze to death, were captured, or managed to get out, and there simply is no single indisputable figure here. Therefore, it is more correct to speak of a heavy, almost complete destruction of a large formation than to cite precise figures, presenting them as the ultimate truth. Any overly confident numbers on this topic should be taken with reservations, and statements about the losses of the opposing side all the more so, because in such events the count always comes from later reconstructions and estimates, not from meticulous ledgers. The same caution should be applied to stories about how small forces destroyed entire columns. Mobile defense in the forest indeed proved incredibly effective, and that is a fact. But behind the beautiful picture of skiers cutting a large army to pieces lies not a miracle, nor an innate superiority of one side over the other. It hides a sum of very concrete things: knowledge of the terrain, proper clothing, the ability to live in the frost, correctly chosen tactics, and, most importantly, the gravest mistakes of the opposing side, which drove itself into a position where its strength did not work. If even some of these conditions were removed, the outcome could have been completely different. Therefore, to see here only the daring of some and the weakness of others is to understand nothing of this history. It is also worth dispelling another common myth, that the outcome of a matter is decided by the simple addition of tanks, guns, and men. At Suomussalmi, it was precisely this arithmetic that failed those who relied on it. The superiority in equipment and numbers existed only as an entry on paper. For it to become a real force, roads were needed on which to deploy, supply lines that reached the troops, winter training, reconnaissance, and communication. Without all this, the large numbers on the staff map remained just numbers, and in the forest, entirely different things decided the outcome. Who could move through the snow, who did not freeze, who saw the enemy first, and who could cut the only road. Once again, the war showed that a force which cannot be applied ceases to be a force. It is also worth adding that this sector of the front was secondary compared to the main directions of that war, and precisely for this reason, its history remained in the shadows. The main attention was focused on the fortified lines in the south, where the fate of the entire campaign was being decided, and against their backdrop, the destruction of a division in a remote forest long seemed a private, almost accidental episode. Yet it was this secondary sector that provided one of the purest examples of how conditions nullify superiority. Where headquarters saw a supporting attack, the men on the ground experienced a full-scale catastrophe, and the gap between significance on the map and the real cost proved immense. If one looks closely at the fate of an ordinary man within this catastrophe, it becomes especially clear at what price the miscalculations of others were paid. Imagine a soldier who, with his unit, was drawn into this forest. He chose neither the road nor the season, nor the plan of attack. He was told to go, and he went. First, there was a long march in the cold, then the first shots from behind the trees, then the news that the road behind them had been cut. Then followed days in encirclement, when there were fewer and fewer bullets, less and less food, less and less warmth, and more uncertainty. He could have been brave, he could have shot accurately, he could have carried a wounded comrade on his back, and still his fate was largely decided not by him, but by those who had never seen this road up close. This is the bitterest part of the story. And that is precisely why it is important not to turn such people into either a faceless mass or a convenient symbol. Each of them was someone's son, brother, or father. Each had a pre-war life to which he hoped to return. They were not asked whether the army was ready for winter, if there was warm clothing, if the route of withdrawal had been thought through. They were simply formed into a column and sent forward, and their entire subsequent fate hinged on decisions made far from this forest by people who never saw the snow, the narrow track, or the faces of those they sent into this trap. One must also remember that on the opposite side there were living people too, not faceless figures from a legend. The defending soldiers froze in the same forest, took risks, died, and grew weary, and their success was paid for by hard work and losses, not given as a gift. Turning them into invulnerable heroes from a poster is just as wrong as depicting the attackers as a faceless mass. Both should be seen first and foremost as people who found themselves in the monstrous conditions of a northern winter war, where the main enemy for everyone was the cold, and human life was devalued with frightening ease. Respect for the fallen on both sides is not a weakness of the narrative, but its essential condition. If one steps back and looks at the whole picture, a clear chain of cause and effect emerges. First came the decision to advance along the single forest road, disregarding the conditions. From it grew a stretched-out column tied to the track without real flanks. This stretched-out formation allowed the enemy to cut the road and break the force into isolated pieces. Isolation cut off supply, And the lack of supply, together with the frost, turned the encircled groups into doomed ones. And on top of all this lay individual ill-fated orders, attempts to break through head-on, and lost time. Each link in this chain hooked onto the previous one, and the further it went, the fewer ways there were to set things right. The lessons of this catastrophe were heavy, but they did not pass without a trace. The Northern War itself showed that numerical superiority and an abundance of equipment are worthless without winter preparation, without proper clothing, without training for forest combat, and without flexible command. The experience of the forest roads forced many to reconsider their usual notions of what constitutes a strong army, and how exactly wars are lost that on paper look won in advance. The road near Suomussalmi became a visual aid on how conditions and miscalculations can outweigh any numbers, and this aid was later recalled more than once by those who thought about future campaigns. The price of this lesson was disproportionately high, and it was paid not by those who drew arrows on the map, but by those who were sent along those arrows into the snow-covered forest. And if a lesson has to be paid for in just this way, then one should at least not pretend it never happened. Otherwise, sooner or later, it will repeat itself on another such narrow road. And yet, what remains most of all after this story is not diagrams or conclusions for headquarters, but the feeling of a quiet, snow-covered forest in which an entire division disappeared. There, among the trees, remained people who were sent to a place where their strength could not help and their courage could not save. They followed orders, believed they were doing their duty, and paid for the overconfidence of others with the highest price possible. The snow quickly covered the tracks, sources diverged in their numbers, and the living details dissolved in time, leaving behind a few lines in textbooks and a long road leading into the forest. Therefore, when remembering Suomussalmi, one should ask oneself not the question of who defeated whom, but another, far more uncomfortable question. How many times in history have people been led into such forest roads, where their lives were from the outset subordinated to someone else's confidence in their own rightness? And if this confidence time and again leads to the same snow-covered result, then what are the beautiful arrows on staff maps really worth, when below them lies the single icy track and thousands of people who have no flanks, no rear, and no way back?